racks of doors. Up above, more doors. Over on this side, quarter panels. These are all right fenders. Still have a black covering on them. They all have antenna holes in them too. Here's more quarter panels. This is a rack of right fenders. Up above it, another rack of right fenders. These are gray dash panels. Whole rack of them. Piles of carpeting, gray carpeting. These racks of automatic trannies. More. Whole nother rack of them back here. Whole sub body. More transmissions. Silver wheels, which supposedly are no longer available. We have entire 3 stacks in bins of silver wheels. There's stacks of motors. This is racks of quarter panels. As far as you can see down here are quarter panels. And doors up above. This is going to be real dark, but this is racks 3 high of motors. These are racks of seats, gray and black seats. On both sides. Which supposedly weren't available, but guess what? Here they are. Seats, more seats. As far as you can see. These boxes appear to be fascias. Hundreds and hundreds of fascias. More racks of quarter panels, 2 high. Over here, more doors. Much more doors. More doors. And even more doors. And racks of doors as far as you can see. Way down here, more doors. And even more doors. On this side, we have more doors. And more doors. More quarter panels. Up here, more doors. Boxes with who knows what. More doors. More quarter panels. As far as you can see. These are racks of hoods, 3 high, racks back about 3 deep, and 2 racks side by side. 1,000 hoods. These are 5-speed transmissions, just literally racks of them as far as you can see.
Climb up here and get a picture of that.
Okay, we'll have a picture of Jason climbing up the rack. More hoods and quarter panels way back in the corner of the warehouse. It's just stacked up. Up here, more doors, more quarter panels, as far as you can see. These are cases of windshields, 25 to a case, at least 25 cases, 26 cases of late windshields. Here we have more racks of quarter panels. Behind that is racks of 5-speed transmissions. And over here, where Jason's drooling, are cases and cases, as far as you can see, of what are marked right fenders. We're wondering if there could be some lefts in there. 10 fenders to a case. Here is another 28 cases of windshields, 25 to a case.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Yeah. We've been circulating one for half a dozen years. There is a there's a 12-hour storage
This is Rob Grady.
Basically, the way we're going to do it is Steve is going to give his presentation, then we'll have a little break, and then we'll start with the tech seminar. Once that's over, then we'll sort of try and split you up into groups, and myself and the members of my staff will escort you around the building. Anything that you'd like to identify, we'll try our best to identify it. Maybe we'll have a competition to see if you can stump us. I know Rob and I have been walking around for a couple of days and we've been banging heads on a few items. So, again, thanks for coming in. Hope you enjoy what you see here. And I'll introduce you to Lee Fontaine.
Morning. Practical thing. Bathrooms, in case. The first time that I had an opportunity to meet the DeLorean owners as a distributor, he mostly dealt with dealers, dealer meetings, and area conventions, things like that. So I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to see so many enthusiasts, which I have been for years. In 1979, I've been heading up the parts department for Saab here, but the headquarters in Connecticut for 10 years. And our service director at Saab at the time, a man by the name of Phil Charles, who was a good friend of mine, had previously worked with Mazda and was now with Saab. And one day, John DeLorean and C.R. Brown, who was the vice president of DeLorean Motor Company and in charge of the North American distribution that was later named DeLorean Motor Cars of America and headquartered in Irvine, California. C.R. Brown and John DeLorean came up to Saab to investigate whether the Saab drivetrain and an engine would be suitable for DeLorean. And at that time, C.R. Brown ran into Phil Charles, who had worked for him in Mazda. C.R. Brown was the one that started Mazda in this country. And later on, he called me and said, I need a service guy. So Phil Charles started to work for DeLorean. Then he called me and said, we need a parts man. So that's how I ended up there. Which was back in '79. My first assignment, I was still in Connecticut. Phil Charles flew up from California, handed me $1,000 and a plane ticket to Belfast. So I came over to Belfast to start getting some information on the spare parts, since it was my responsibility to build our inventories as well as putting together dealer kits and so forth. And when I first came over there, what you see there is the plant. They were pouring the concrete for the assembly plant and all things, so there was nothing there. It was just a shack with a few people sitting there. They had a purchasing department, so mostly it was a handful of people, mostly engineers that were planning the assembly line. And they had one guy in charge of parts, so I asked him, what kind of information do you have? What's going into this car? I don't know. Because at the time, Lotus was contracted to do the engineering design. Up to this point, DeLorean had been looking around all over for some place to build the car and looking for the best possible deal. And they had practically were about to sign the papers to build it in Puerto Rico, when Northern Ireland Development Agency Northern Ireland, Belfast at the time had about 45–50% unemployment, and still has a big problem, as you know. And they offered him a deal where they fronted about $120 million, and it was written in such a way that based on the number of job opportunities he created, he would be written off, and so he just had to accept it. At the time, he had his engineer that had developed a prototype, and maybe we should start looking at the film that I have here. When I decided to go to Northern Ireland, the chief engineer said, no way I'm moving to Northern Ireland. So John was faced with a situation he had no engineering design. That's why he contracted with Lotus, Colin Chapman. So Lotus was designed to build the first 14 prototypes. So when I was over there in Ireland, couldn't find any information, I flew back to England and up to Lotus. And I sat down with the different engineering groups. We had chassis, engine groups, whatever, just to get some insight. What parts are going into it, who are the suppliers, how can I make sure that I get parts, continue, because I don't know if you're familiar with it, but England has always been a poor supplier of parts. They had their problems. If one group go on strike, they all strike, and they just sit and can't get parts for a month. So my objective was to find alternate sources for parts. I could always supply parts to our dealers. Prior to this, we had the prototype car that was built here in this country with a mid-engine, Citroen engine actually. That was a car that C.R. Brown and his sales guys were pulling around the country, getting potential dealers together to attract them to become a dealer, which they paid $25,000 just to become a dealer. No, they did get stocks, of course, which turned out to be useless. So maybe we should start taking a look at the film that we showed at the time for the dealers. That's how we built a dealer network of over 300 dealers. But before we got to that point, we had a lot of work. It was our job to put together all the service manuals, the parts catalogs, all technical literature, training material, and so forth. And since we were all under tremendous pressure to get this car into the market, which was already about 4 or 5 years late at the time, we placed 3 guys. We had handpicked all our people. We had combined sales, service, and parts representatives, and that we had selected, and we interviewed and made sure that they were able to do the job. We took 3 of the best ones and placed them in Belfast, and they were there for about 3 months. They took everything that came from Lotus, took it apart, photographed it, built it together, and that's how we built the material for the service manuals and so forth. So by the time the car you saw here is, of course, the first prototype that was built here in the U.S. And Giugiaro then redesigned it, became a little more rounded corners and so forth in the interior. And the design, engineering design, which was Lotus, of course, was based on Lotus background, which was basically the Esprit, Lotus Esprit. In order for Lotus to handle this, Lotus had never built a volume production car. They hand-built their cars. And it was quite obvious when I was there that we were in for a ride. Because the people they had put together were all the engineers that had been laid off from British Motors at the time, Leyland and everything. They had closed down many plants, about many people available. And Lotus hired them all and put them on this project. And there was a lot of struggle to get everything together as design was going on. I got hold of an engineering parts list that grew by the day and by the minute with new parts that they put in. and they left the old ones in there. So after a while, you had no idea what was going into the car. It was 3 or 4 different models of each item, you know, 2, 3, 4 alternators, and things like that. So finally, we had a sit down with the Lotus engineers, chief engineers, and clean up this engineering parts list so we could get the handle on the actual parts that was going to go in. But there were changes up to the, well, not only up to the, when they went into production. There were changes on a daily basis as we were in production. So the first few hundred cars may vary in details here and there. Finally, we got the first cars to California, where we were headquartered, in May of 1981. We flew in the first 27 cars. And we took a look at them, and C.R. Brown said, there's no way we can sell this car for $25,000. So we went out the same day and we leased an old Chrysler auction center. And we took in the cars there, tore them apart, and built up one model prototype that we put on a pedestal. And C.R. Brown said, no car leaves this quality assurance center unless it looks like that one. Because when the car came, the panels were misaligned, you know, they looked terrible. Ireland never built a car. And we then had to design or complete certain items that we had manufactured here in the U.S. and that later on, when the plant had a chance to evaluate it, got into production. We had terrible problems like the door guides. You've seen the ones, the heavy cast iron door guides were the ones we produced in California. And when the plant finally got them, they came to DeLorean Fast. And there's a bunch of stuff like that. But we finally got them out, and in order to get this quality assurance center together, we pulled in all our district sales service parts managers, and they were the ones that tore them apart and built them up again. And we spent up 65 hours per car to make them ready for sale. So we didn't make much money. It all went into overhead. But once we had set up the routine how to do it, then we hired people and trained them to do the job. So every car went through our quality assurance center, and we had 3 of them. We had one in New Jersey, we had one in Michigan, and we had one in California. You have to excuse me. I'm old and my memory is short. So I have some notes that I've got to look at times here. So in order to get the plant to function properly, we flew over all the assembly foremen and their quality personnel. We flew them over on their vacation to California, and we trained them in our quality assurance center for a 3-week period how to build the car. And from that point on, the cars got better and better. The quality got improved on a daily basis, actually. While we were operating out of California, John DeLorean was in New York, where he had an office on, I think it was Madison Avenue, where he was involved in several other projects and spent really very little time on the car since that was going by itself. He had a company, he bought the Logan snow grooming equipment company in Utah. He had composite technology that it was supposed to produce all the fiberglass parts for the car, but weren't ready in time for production. So we have about 2 or 3 pieces from composite technology in the car, license plate. The rear license plate holder is one of them. And there's a couple of panels, usual panels that they did. And he was involved in a shipping company, he was involved in some space industry, and we got a lot of directive from John DeLorean that we had to spend time on investigating. We were going to take over the distribution of alpha cards, which was a rat nest. Fortunately, we didn't have to. I hated that one. And things were pretty good because when we started to sign dealers, and since this car had been in the automotive press for the past 4 years, a lot of people were interested to buy it. And the dealers took orders. And we had, as far as we knew, 9,000 cars pre-sold, where potential owners had put down $1,000 as a deposit, and they were in line. I mean, a dealer could have 10, 15, 20 people in line to buy cars. And some were absolutely crazy. Some guys bought another place in the line for a few $1,000s. And the first car that was actually sold was sold for $40,000. Although our price was $25,000. Some dealers charged a little more. And things were looking pretty good until the winter of 81, 82 set in, which was the worst winter we've had in this country for 80 years at the time. And car sales just stopped all over the country. And we ran into trouble money-wise. We had about 120 people, I think, in our organization at the time, and we had to meet payroll. So John DeLorean went back to the British government and asked for more money, which they didn't give it. The reason being that this DeLorean project had become a political bomb in England. That no one had spent so much money on one project. At the time, I think about $140 million had been channeled to John DeLorean. So it was really critical at that time. And there was a conference call between John DeLorean, some people in New York, the plant management, and C.R. Brown, and they discussed what to do in this situation. And everyone was pretty much in agreement on, at the time we were producing 40 cars a day. And the quality still left some things to be desired. So the recommendation was, let's take down the production to 25 cars a day, lay off some people, work with the British government, and try to straighten this out. Because they probably would have done it because they did it with Learjet. A lot of other American manufacturers had established themselves in Northern Ireland to help resolve that problem they had there. And they said, cars a day, and maybe in April sales will start picking up and we can pick up again. But John DeLorean himself said, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to up the production to 80 cars a day. We're going to hire 1,000 more people in Ireland, and now they have to give me more money. So that's what we did. And John DeLorean went back to the British government and he had hired 1,000 more people. We need money. And they didn't dare. They said, no more money. So it took, about that time, it took 3 weeks, and the plant went into receivership because they couldn't meet the obligation to all the suppliers that now had doubled their production, and goods were flowing in from all over to Europe, actually. So we were in this strange situation, really, and we couldn't operate. When the plant went into receivership, I couldn't get parts unless we paid cash for it. We had no money, so that's how this deal came about with Consolidated International up here in Columbus, Ohio. They financed all the cars that we had in country at the time, which I think was about 2,000 to 3,000 cars in imports. In essence, they bought the cars from us, fronted the money, so we could be paid over. And as we sold them to dealers, we paid, I think they bought them for $9,000 and we paid them $14,000 to buy them back. So that's how Consolidated International got into the picture. And we were working, at the time, we had a new management in Northern Ireland, which was Don Lander, who had taken over after Chuck Fenton. And they were working to get more financing. And according to Don Lander, we were about a couple of weeks away from getting a 200 million loan for the export finance. I was sitting in the office at 10 o'clock one morning, and the radio was on, and I hear John DeLorean was picked up at the LA airport with 0.7 kilos of cocaine. The same afternoon, we filed for the Chapter 11, filed for bankruptcy protection. There was nothing else to do. And at the same time, Consolidated International filed suit to take possession of the cars that they actually own. And we were in a deal then with the DeLorean lawyer and Consolidated's lawyer. Consolidated bought all the assets of DeLorean Motor Company. So they came out to California and they looked over the situation and they said to me they wanted to keep on operating and asked me if I wanted to work with them. So I started up operation again and brought my people back so we started sending out cars to dealers, at least what we had. And then I flew over to Belfast with the representative from Consolidated. And we started our production. We finished all the cars that were sitting, well, some cars were finished sitting in the port, waiting to be shipped. Then the whole assembly line had cars in different stages. We finished all those cars. We started our production of doors, fenders. The doors were made in plant. We just got the shells and then we assembled them into plant. So I shipped over a couple of $1 million worth of spare parts that were desperately needed at the time. And then I contacted all the vendors and asked them to keep their tools and because we were going to start up again. And Consolidated, at least what they said, but they also bought an option on the plant in Ireland. And a couple of months went by, we got things moving, dealers got their parts and so forth. And then they decided, we also went over to Renault in France and negotiated with them to get engine transmission parts and so forth. But then they decided not to take that option to start up the plant. I don't think they ever had any serious thoughts of doing it. But they bought all the assets of the plant. So I had to go back to Ireland again, and like you see here, all the spare parts they had for assembly, I was climbing all over it. Ship, scrap. So whatever you see here is what I decided should be here. But recently I might have missed some, but the plant was as empty when I left it as it was when I first got it. And then I've been working with Consolidated first, but then KAPAC bought the parts team from KAPAC. And I worked with Mark and Katz. First of all, setting up this warehouse. Most of the racks and the carousels you see were the racks that I had in California that came up from there. We set up this warehouse and brought everything in. I was kind of sad, since it's sort of an exotic car. It's kind of sad to see it go down the drain. I would still consider it, the DeLorean saga, sort of a success, because once it got going, not only by rumors for 2 or 3 years and ideas and so forth, once it got going, was a very small group of people managed to build the car, get it out, build up a nationwide distribution network, and there was a lot of hard work involved, and we were all very proud of being part of it. And I must say, I really do appreciate Stephen Wynn shouldering this responsibility of continuing this parts supply. And I've been working with Stephen over the past 15 years, feeding him information that he needed about parts suppliers, and just in an attempt to make sure that you, the owners, can have your cars and enjoy riding. And hopefully we can get more of them on the road now with what you see here. And actually, if you look at the quality of a car, or the quality of any product for that matter, it's a combination of the product itself and the aftermarket support. And if you don't, the aftermarket support is going to have to make up for any design flaws you have in the product. And unfortunately, most product just comes on the market, and then they disappear before even the warranty is up. So with this part supply and this ambition that Stephen has, we may improve the quality of the DeLorean from now on. Let's hope so. Here's the layout of the plan, and if you have any questions, I also brought some handouts from an article that was written by Peter Levin. You probably have read it maybe, but he was one of the journalists that was tracking the story of the DeLorean, and they're pretty interesting to read. I'm sure you've read some of the books already. And I guess that's about all I have to talk about, unless you have any specific questions.
Jenny, how many cars?
The exact number, I think it was about 8,500 cars. The first 500, I think they drove right into the pond. Couldn't even sell.
Lee, you said that you had like 120 people in California. Was that just at the Quality Assurance Center?
Now, including the quality assurance centers, that we had about 30 people. We had our whole staff, of course, like I had about 10 to 15 people in the warehouse and so forth. And we had our field reps. About 20, 25 people that we covered the whole country.
So there really weren't very many
Well,
people. I mean, in total, about yourself.
well, that's just the California part. Then you have Northern Ireland, of course, where you're talking about thousands. And then DeLorean, his office in New York had a stack of people. I don't know what the heck they were doing. It was costly. That office in New York cost $750,000 a month with payroll and rent. So that's where a lot of money went. It was just the building up.
What in the world is this DeLorean Motor Company to use Lucas to wire a car? What was the reasoning behind that?
The reasoning?
Yeah.
They had no choice. I mean, the guys that were sitting there designing the car, they took what was close at hand. I would have preferred to build a car in Puerto Rico, then we could have picked up the good parts from wherever. But there's too many British parts of poor quality in the car. But, it's not partially due to the rush to get the car out. You know, we had actually or the Bible, if you want, all changes that were necessary to the car, as far as suspension and everything in the car. And they were scheduled over a 3-year period before they could get all those changes in. From the moment we started to build the car, there were constant improvements going on. not enough. We never got to that.
Why is it that on leftover parts that there weren't, like the left front fenders and there's an abundance of all the other body parts?
Well, we've been talking about that, and Steven seems to think that we only had right-hand fenders, but I know that we had at least, I had equal amounts of lefts and rights. But then again, the left-hand fender is more prone to accidents, I guess, and maybe sell 10 to 1, so you deplete the inventory. And when I moved this in here, which is 15 years ago, there's another warehouse on the other side of that wall, just as big as this. It was practically full of all sheet metal. We had fenders, doors, so you see the doors and stuff. Then they had consolidated, that's why it's so cramped. But at the time, we had plenty of fenders.
So they were just
But
using
it could have been also that we couldn't get it in sufficient quantity for certain things from that who made the fender. I really don't recall.
Can you explain what happened to the dies for the fenders and the doors and all?
Well, the dies for the fenders, I'm not quite sure if they belonged to DeLorean. I would think they had paid for them, but they were in the possession of the company that was stamping them, of course. And I know for a fact that Marvin Katz was trying to get hold of all the tools and dies, because his intention when he bought this was to start producing the car again. Matter of fact, he contacted John DeLorean and suggested that they got back in the production of the car with all the parts he had. But I think, I don't know who made those decisions, why the dies disappeared. I can't answer that for you.
Did Margaret Thatcher have something to do with that?
Marvin?
Margaret Thatcher, didn't she have something to do with body dyes being dumped?
I doubt that very seriously. The British government, this whole thing probably wasn't a political embarrassment, but they weren't involved in any details of the car or parts or anything like that.
Perhaps later we also have another video that we're going to show, which was a video that was recorded by John DeLorean last year for Irish television, and questions about the dies and the politics were all answered by DeLorean. So this has not been aired in the same way.
And my co-author, the instigator, starting this book was Robert Gill and myself. And we tried to respond to the membership instead of getting too involved in political aspect of it. I can get some support for that. Well, we did the best we could on the board and all this sort of stuff. We were very on board with everything else, and enough of that. We're not stealing the Medical Party's membership. We're on the internet. We were advertising in Hemmings, and for that we got $1,000 names so far. And we've done it on our own effort. We appreciate your support. The ones who either have joined the organization, I'm sure in time that you will get something in return for what you're being supported to do. So we're kind of building our assets in order to come up with publications, initiatives, and others right now. So my own application, if you haven't already joined, just see me, and I'll be glad to give your application and become a member. Just before I left, we got into some products, and this is one of the first items, the shirts. I have a few of those too. And so if you'd like to join, if you want to talk to me about anything that pertains to DeLorean, that you'd like to see to be promoted on your behalf, I'm happy to do it. So it's your plug on anybody else. It's yours as well.
May start with you sitting down, but maybe better as he points things out that you walk around the car. The fenders are not fastened to it, so don't lean on it. fall off. The left end is already rented. Overall.
Will you sell that at a discounted price?
Basically, I'm going to try and do this for people, see what happens if we don't kind of know about the cars. It'd be easier if people kind of circulate around as I talk. Hopefully everybody can see it. It's hard for me to talk about something because I'll be down here looking in the car and I'm not going to see it anyway. It's going to be a little bit difficult to do it, but if everybody kind of walks around and doesn't just everybody stay in one spot, hopefully they'll get to see what they want to say. So I think we'll try and do it that way and see if it works. If it doesn't, then we'll sit down and we're going to give that a shot. So you guys will just get it up. I think we'll go over to the radiators. Pretty much everybody used to push the metal ones because the plastic ones are about $363. They're very expensive. And they are hard to repair, which is the major drawback with the originals. But the nice thing about them is the fit is very, they were engineered for the car. It's very consistent. So you know that it's just going to bolt up. A lot of the metal radiators, particularly recently, it seems a lot of the cores are not of the quality they used to be. And so it's kind of hard to find a good aftermarket metal one. Recently I hooked up with a company that I've had very good luck with on a 3-row radiator. But the price now, Steve has dropped the price to $202 on the plastic ones. So except for the idea of repairability, it's a good price. And so you sort of have your option as to which one you go with. If you do a metal radiator in place of the original plastic ones, when it comes time to do it, one thing you have to make sure of, this one doesn't have the fan cowl, but when you bolt up the fan cowl, you've got to make sure on the metal ones that they're not touching on the corners. Because a lot of them will have bigger tanks, and so if you get any touching from the cowl to the radiator, ultimately the road vibration of using the car is going to cause it to leak. So that's the thing to check for if you're going to retrofit a different one. The stock ones are nice because everything fits perfectly. When we're rehosing a car in the shop, one of the keys and one of the most important reasons to change hoses, even on a car that say has 10,000 or 12,000 miles, it's original. The big problem is the hoses over the years in these cars that are sat tend to seep a little bit. And coolant, once it's exposed to the air, can be quite corrosive. So a lot of times the reason we're changing hoses on a low mileage car is so that we can take the pipes down and clean the coolant pipes. If you wait too long and you have lots of corrosion on them, and you go to rehose the car, if you clean up the pipes, you're going to have all kinds of holes in them. So that's a main reason for doing it on a car where the hoses appear to be in decent shape. You get new clamps on there, you get all the pipes properly cleaned up so that you don't have to replace them later on. I was under the assumption that several of the front pipes were no longer available, but yesterday I saw a box of a couple hundred of them, so at least that's not a problem. The one that most commonly has to be replaced is the joiner pipe over here because it has a bleeder and it's on the curve, and if you get a hole there, you can't just lengthen your hose. On a lot of the straight pipes, if you have a hole after it's glass beaded, you run a little extra length of hose and you can get around that problem. But the ones that have curves in it are not so easy. But those are available. So that's a problem that doesn't exist that I thought was. There's a lot of things here that we were told over the years are no longer available. I assume they just couldn't find them. But basically, when you're rehosing the car, if it is a low mileage car, you probably won't have to do the heater hoses. They hold up. The larger the hose, the more prone it is to expanding and needing to be replaced and to blowing up. So a lot of the times in low mileage cars, you don't have to bother with a heater hose. It saves you a lot of extra work because some of the hoses are over here, and when the chassis is on the car, they're very difficult to get at unless you pull the intake manifold. Another thing with the cooling system that you have to deal with and is really common, and when I was down in Virginia, I was really surprised, this was a month ago, there was a show down there, to see about half the cars didn't even have the basic relay update kit. And there's a relay box over here that if you lock it and you walk away and the door locks inside to engage, that can run down your battery in an hour or so. And there's a solenoid screen to draw a lot of current. What's that? That's what we designed so that you never have a chance to treat them. There's at least one person here, Tony Ellis, that is doing a frame off on his car now. And I'm I'm going to kind of point out the things that we do when we do a frame-off restoration. It's the same thing on any area of the car. If it's worn, if you want to just apply it to a certain area, like rebuilding the front suspension, you can apply it to that. It doesn't mean you're going to do a frame-off. You know, you can apply it to that aspect of the car. For instance, if, say you're changing the shocks, and you find there's a lot of rust on the control arms, very, very common. You can have somebody work that on the car if you don't have severe problems with it. A lot of times all you have is a little bit of peeling paint, and it doesn't look like a big problem. But if you let it go another 5 years, it is a big problem. You can wind up rotting the control arms to the point where they get weak and they can crack on you. Lower control arms are virtually unavailable on the originals. Very rare that you find them in dealer inventories. And a replacement one is very expensive. So it's worth, if you're doing any kind of suspension work, you have the shocks out, and if you have a rust problem, it's worth taking them off, having them glass beaded, and then refinish them in a better coat of paint. You don't have to have them powder coated. That's a nice option, but you can go with just a primer coat and then spray them up with like a body shoots, that type of material. That's like, basically it's an undercoat, a good quality undercoat. And that gives them a lot more resistance to stone chipping and that kind of thing. But it can also be worked on the car. You can sand it. You can sand them by hand, get all the loose rust off, and buy yourself a can of spray-on undercoating. I always put a base coat of regular paint on first, of a good quality regular paint, and then spray undercoating over that. But that's something you could do without having to send it to a shop if you don't have a real severe problem. Another thing this car does not have is the safety recall that all the 81s require. Some of the early 82s didn't have. This frame plate is supposed to be on both sides of the chassis and bolts up there. So if you look underneath your car and where the stabilizer bar bolts up, you don't have these. Real important to put these on. If you hit a curve at a couple miles an hour, you're gonna crunch this crumple tube. There's very little strength there. So that's a real important thing to do. It goes right underneath. See where these holes are? It lines up with the mount to the clamp of the stabilizer. Okay, right there. So you need to have that on both sides. You don't have to drill down. Are still missing that, and that's readily available, that kit. But another part of the kit is castle nuts that you drill and pin in place instead of the nuts that they're using, these aircraft-style lock nuts. These had problems. Supposedly they had problems with them backing off. And then there was a recall, which was coated orange by the dealers, where they would drill that and pin it. And the original recall just had a strengthening bracket that went over the original clamp. And then they didn't feel that that was sufficient. So they had a new recall. And so we would get a car in, we would pin this and put the additional bracket on, and then we got the new recall, orange or red. You had the second recall, it would be blue. So the easy way to check your car, if somebody did it by the book, and you have the blue recall, chances are it was done correctly, because then they were following the dealer sheet and then went through the whole route on it. And a lot of cars will have that, so that's easy to look for. But a lot of times they'll put the kit on, particularly after the fact that went out of business and people were just buying parts and putting it on, you may not have those paint markings. So if you don't have that, definitely take a look at your front end. And you can do that without jacking up the car, you just put it underneath. At the same time, on here, these nuts as well, they were using a single nut on the back of the stabilizer bar. And the recall, you double nut that. So that's another thing to look for. And also look for the cotter pins. All these areas, again, should be coated the color blue if it was done by the book. Let's see. On the steer,
Safety wire, you don't have.
well, you could do that, but if you safety wire it, you're going to have to drill a hole, correct? So you might as well at that point put a castle nut on it. That would be my recommendation. It's good on things like that to keep it original. Do it by the book. Chances are, if you don't have that, you're not going to have your plates. There are some cars you'll see where they did the easy part and didn't do that, but generally, if they did one thing, the kit was there and they put the whole thing on. And that's something you should probably keep as stock as possible so that there's no confusion whether it was done correctly. Also, we're seeing lots of steering racks that are loose. The racks are not the most durable units in the world. They're pretty lightweight. And if you have 40 or 50,000 miles on your car, probably you've got a lot more play than you realize. The car should start to turn in. If you turn the wheel an inch you should feel something, and you should feel the car respond to that. We get cars in the shop, you go 3 and you go like this, and there's nothing there, you know, which tends to mask higher vibration problems, but it's not good for much else. So normally when we get a car in the shop, we'll take the rack out. A lot of times you'll have a lot of corrosion on the body of it. We'll break it down, we'll blast feed the body, refinish that, and then we'll rebuild the thing. Internally, we change the bearings. Racks now, the new ones have been unavailable for about 6 months or so. So there's not a lot of options on that. We have made up internal parts for it because I saw it coming. So that's not really a big problem area, but it's just something to be aware of. You can't buy new racks anymore. Yeah, I don't think any are going to turn up. If they don't have them here, I haven't seen them turn up anywhere else. It was designed for the car. A lot of these bits and pieces on the chassis, even though they were designed by Lotus, they don't fit Lotus. The theory is similar to the Esprit, but it's not the same car. You know, it's a heavier car, and it was designed a little bit differently. Very, very little retrofit that you can do in the way of suspension.
The frame not the same.
No, not at all. No, and actually the Esprit is a totally different style. The geometry is similar. You have the same construction as the trailing arms, and I think the bushing is a crossover. That's the only part I'm aware of. That bushing, there's plenty of stock on that. The trailing arm bushing, that's a problem area of the car that we're going to deal with shortly too as I get past the front of it.
Question.
Sure.
The crush tube protectors up front,
Right.
those are readily available.
Yeah, I really didn't look for them here, but I haven't heard that that's a problem. Steve around anywhere? No. Check with him on it. As far as I know, there's plenty of stock on that. Yeah, I think there's plenty of those. But you should get the whole kit. If you buy the kit, it's about $141 or something like that. But if you buy one plate, I think they're about $60 or something. So it's more cost effective to buy the whole kit. It's very rare that you only need one piece of it anyway. Lots of problems with frame rust, and a lot of times it begins with the brake master cylinder, say in the front section. That'll start to leak on cars with 5,000 miles, say, real low miles. You figure out the brake master cylinder. The car's 15 years old. If somebody wasn't changing that fluid every 2 or 3 years, chances are you put the car back on the road and it's going to start leaking when you start using it. Real common problem, and most people aren't aware of it until they lose their brake pedal. And the way that starts, at a light, you're sitting there, all of a sudden the brake pedal goes down to the floor once, and then you pump it, comes back up, that's it. It works fine for a month after that. But once you get that problem, it's going to recur. You're smiling. I guess we have another bad brake master. And another problem is if you open up the cup and you see you got an original master and it's full of debris, black as hell in there, green, strange color, or orangey looking. If you just bleed the brakes and you don't change the brake master cylinder, now you're really going to be starting to lose your pedal because now it's going to start pumping out. So if it's never been done on your car, it hasn't been done in 5 or 8 years, and you see that's dark in there, don't even touch the fluid until you're ready to at least put a brake master on, because you'll have more problems. But that's the kind of thing that if you delay very long, your calipers are going to start binding up. The calipers have been basically quite reliable on this car, but on the cars that have never had the fluid change, they're doing a lot. They're sticking like crazy now. But for the first 10 years, they survived a lot of neglect without problems. Brake masters, though, if you don't change it every few years, it's going to go bad on you when you do finally change the fluid. So you got to be kind of prepped to put a new master on, flush everything through. Whoever's doing it should check all the wheels for binding when they're done. Make sure the calipers are straight. Caliper rebuild kits and pistons for the calipers are readily available. It's not really a problem. Brake master cylinders are available. So it's really not a problem getting the parts. They're not cheap, but they're not outlandishly expensive, and it's brakes. You really don't want to play with it. But what happens as a result of the leaking is, on a brake master, when it's going bad, it's going to drip down here. It's kind of hard to see that when the car is assembled. So you don't really know if it drips down on the closeout plate for the fuel tank. And the only way you really kind of notice that there's a problem is on this side of the frame where it vents out over here. I'm just going to show you the area for the people on this side. You'll see where the paint is kind of soft and ripply and maybe peeling off a little bit. If you get that, you pull the frame plate down with the bolts here, and you'll see you'll have a big mess where it's all peeled up and lifted. Looks like a lizard skin underneath there. At that point, that's the cause, invariably. And that's what gets things started on the frames a lot of times if the car's just been sitting around. Besides the normal road use, there's a lot of cars that come in, if they didn't have the reinforcement kit, you'll get a little crumple there, and wherever you get a ding on the frame, because the epoxy is so rigid, it'll flake, and then water will get under there. And if you're driving the car in the wet, or if you even live in a damp area or it's humid in the summer, you'll start to get the rust on the car. And once it starts, because the frame is very thin, it can be a problem in a matter of a couple of years after that. So that's something that everybody should look into, regardless of what they think the history of their car is. You should have somebody get it up on either in the air or jack it up yourself. Look over the primary areas of rust, which will be the front crush tube area. Over here, look for signs of rippling over here. On the rear rail, directly underneath the engine, where the slave cylinder is, the exact same problem. Clutch fluid and brake fluid are the same thing. You'll get, it doesn't leak out that fast, but you get a drop here and a drop there. And a drop of brake fluid on the frame epoxy, you let it sit there for a couple days and it lifts the paint. It doesn't take much. So there's a lot of problems with the center rail there, getting that problem where the corrosion started. Fortunately, with the center, it's easier access, and there's just less prone for it to say rot out from the center. You really don't get that very often, except on the real worst cases. But it's still an area that has to be addressed once you have that problem. So that's something that should be checked. Inside in the frame itself is another big problem, just because of the fact that the chassis is dipped in epoxy. You'll find, if you look at the frames over there where they're cut apart on the ends, you'll see the epoxy, there's a big plug of epoxy in there. And it can also be inside the rails here, a 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch thick. And when you have all the uneven paint surface, a lot of times over the years, expansion, contraction from heat, it lifts up and cracks. Internally, that's very common. And then the moisture from the air or from driving the car in the rain gets in there and it stays in there for weeks at a time. And you wind up having the car rotting from the inside out. And that sounds impossible to deal with, but it really isn't impossible to deal with. But it does entail looking up in the openings of the frame. So this chassis, on the bottom of it, you're going to find holes like this, but they'll be bigger. Okay? You'll have a hole on each side, but there's no hole in the center. In the shop, when I get a car and we're doing any work, first thing I do is do an equal size hole in the center. It might not be original, but if you want to keep the original frame, it's a good idea to do it. So you make an equal size hole, then you look up there with a light, and a lot of times in the center where people have jacked up the car, you're going to find you got a rust problem. That's another thing. If you're jacking up the car, you got to put a block on it, either rubber pad or a wooden block, because if you jack up the car from the frame rail here or in the back, you're going to dent the car. You're going to dent the chassis, and inside, it's going to lift up and flake, and the moisture in there is going to start to rust. So we see lots of problems there when we drill that open. By drilling that, though, now you're allowing any water that gets in the top here to vent out. You got a hole in the top, and then even if you're washing the car, water's coming down by the fuel pump, drips down, and it can wind up in that hole. So you can get water in that hole, and it can't vent out, and it takes a long time for it to evaporate, and you're going to have lots of problems. If you have that problem, what we do is a very low-tech fix, but it's really the only cost-effective way of doing it is you just take curved screwdrivers, we bend them to shape, make a sharp edge on them, and you just look up in there with a little flexible light, which tool stores carry, and you just pick away. You just chip, 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 and get all the loose epoxy off. And then we spray a body wax material on there. But if you were to do the prep work and then bring it to a shop that does rust proofing and have them spray basically a translucent rust-proof coating on there is what you're looking for, what most people call body wax. You spray that in there, you do 2 or 3 coats because it goes on very thin. You let it set for a couple hours between coats. You do that, you're going to save yourself a world of grief in the near future. Not near future, but if you're keeping the car, you're going to save yourself a lot of trouble.
Is it closed-in section? If you pull a tank out, you can't get from the back.
You can't, right. What will give you a lot of access is if you're going to take the trouble to do your suspension work, you have very good access to both of the outer sections. they're sealed off. It's boxed off in here, so this center section is its own little box. And that's why a lot of problems begin in the center section. All right? But you can do a lot of work from this side if you have the suspension now. So if you're doing any kind of suspension work, or your mechanic is, very important to have them look for the problem. And if they're equipped to deal with it, do it then. In fact, you should find out if you're having somebody do suspension work on your car, if they can handle rust work, because otherwise you're going to pay twice, down the road. And I always believe if you're in an area of the car and you got two problems, you don't fix one and then get the guy coming back a year later. You do everything that could be wrong in that area of the car. It saves that person a lot of money in the long run. Let me think. Okay, let's do fuel tank stuff. All right.
One thing I think that's important to mention
Anonymous with
that's what they
with
use.
.4, so I'm
Right.
not aware that's a big problem.
Well,
So in other words, you had somebody use, like, say, an American.
Well, I put it in myself. They told me .4 is .4 no matter who makes it, but it's a different chemical makeup, and the seals won't take it. They'll swell.
Well, there are European spec rubbers and American spec,
Right.
and that may have not changed. It definitely was true when the car was made.
Right, the car
you
has-
cannot run .3 in this car. Okay?
Or
apparently
anybody else's .4.
It's very easy to find Castle Girling .4.
Right.
Very easy. So obviously, then stick with that. That's
Yeah,
the
because
reason.
I've seen
anything
people
else.
that are using other .4s, and they are going through brake cylinders and everything right and left. And I tell them you got to
That's a good
switch
point.
fluids.
Some people say, hey, let's run .5 silicone. I've done that on a few cars. If you're willing to rebuild everything, you can do that. But basically, I don't recommend mix, even though they'll tell you .5 and .4,
Right.
these are compatible. They're really not, because if you do that and then you pull the wheels, you pull the cylinders out of the calipers and stuff, you'll see they're not mixed. They're all like coagulated. They may not destroy, but it's not really a good idea. And the other thing I've seen, even on cars where we've changed, say on the clutch, the slave and the master cylinder at the same time, basically that's what all the rubber seals in the clutch setup. It's not going to hurt it, and you might get a little bit better pedal feel, but the longevity, if you don't change the fluid, you're going to have leaks. It's not as good a lubricant as .4. So what you make up in water absorption, because .5 doesn't absorb water, and you make up in better heat, capability of heat boiling point, you're losing in the lubricity. So I really think it's best to just stick with .4 and ideally change it every 2 years. Even if the car is sitting, change it every 2 years. It's a lot cheaper to do that than to be replacing parts.
Plus, you might want to point out that when the cylinder leaks in the firewall for the clutch, it goes inside the car. It fills underneath the carpet, and everybody's unaware of it.
Another thing is, when you have these hydraulic leaks, the only way you're going to know of it is by checking your fluid level.
Right.
And see if the fluid level goes down on the clutch. The brakes, the fluid level will go down as the brakes wear, so it's a little more misleading. But on the clutch fluid should be a 1/4 inch from the where the neck comes up. All right, it should be a 1/4 inch below, because you have to allow for a little bit of fluid expansion when the car heats up. But invariably, it will not go. The clutch wear is so negligible that it won't affect your fluid height. If you look in, your bottle's half empty, you definitely have a clutch fluid leak. Now you just have to determine where. You'll have stains. If you look carefully with the lights, more than 2 years, and you're going to have some problems in the tank, is what I found. And a lot of it also depends on where you live. If you have change of seasons, get real hot in the summer, cold in the winter, you're more prone to have problems. All right. If it's sitting in a heated garage, you might get an extra year before the fuel starts turning sour. The key with that is to at least run the car every month, 2 months if you have to. I break my own rules with my car. I've got a car that's really clean. It's in the back of my parts room. I've always got a bunch of cars in front of it in the gated area, and it's hard for me to get the thing out. So I'm telling you this, and sometimes I don't start my car for 3 or 4 months. And you can get away with that, but you can't let the car sit for a year or two and expect not to have problems. You got to get that fuel moving around. You start the car, you run it, everything gets moved. It sort of just keeps the fuel from stagnating to the point where it starts decomposing and breaking down. But that alone, you can't run the tank for 5 years that way too, just starting it. Sooner or later, you got to run the gas out and put fresh in. But
fuel stabilizers, they say.
They are very, very helpful. I have seen people put in fuel stabilizer, have the car sitting for 4 or 5 years, and they'll just tell you it's good for a year. You read on the can, it's only good for a year, but it will, in my limited experience with it, because most people just don't do it, But I've had several customers where they've already been through the route once, and I've told them, when we did some fuel work, try some stabilizer if you're going to put it away. And then 5 years later, I didn't use it, but I threw stabilizer in it. You tow the car and you take a look in the tank, and no problems. So I don't have enough experience to say, are some stabilizers better than others. Most of them are the same as far as I'm told. There's a couple, like Port 15 makes one. They claim theirs is a little different. I'm not sure about that. But I do think it's a good idea to have fuel stabilizers. Yes?
All you need to do is put chemical high test gas.
Well, that's another, the better the quality of the gas that you leave in that car too. If you're going to let a car sit, put the best grade of gas that you've got available to you. Amoco's a good, Amoco's a pretty consistent brand. Sunoco's supposedly another very good brand. That makes a difference. You put in some, low quality fuel, and there's a lot of garbage fuel out nowadays too. And you can put some fuel in there will probably break down in 6 or 10 months. There's some fuels I've seen in our area, you put it in the car and the car won't restart. That's how bad some of this stuff is, where they've dumped stuff in there and mixed different fuels. So it's a problem in Illinois.
Premium, he's talking about the only stuff that doesn't have alcohol.
Really? And they don't? Because usually in the states that have that, that's federal legislation.
Yeah, it's the only one that doesn't have
I'm surprised that it's not mandated in your state. What's
it.
happening?
Somehow Amazon got around it on the premium. Real expensive gas. It's only in their premium.
As you do with a metal tank. So that's why, at least I believe the main reason why, the tradition says full tank of fuel, is because you're dealing with a steel tank. And you're going to have a lot more problems with condensation and therefore rust. The steel parts in this tank, basically, these are the two biggest pieces of steel in the tank. All right. Now, if you have fuel that's in there and it's breaking down, this is what it does. It works on the boot, and any kind of moisture in the tank will work on the steel parts. It'll lock up your fuel pump. It'll damage all these parts. And except for the pump, everything here was on the bill. There's no stock, say in KAPAC. So it's whoever's had these things made up. And there's a couple people have, I've had the metal pieces made up. I think I'm the only one that has the metal parts made up because I see a lot of it in my area where you get this. And I don't believe in putting it back together with just a new boot if you've got rust. Because invariably this stuff will wind up in the fuel injection down the road. But this stuff is available, but it's expensive because it's all made in batches of 100 pieces. So there's no reason to let it get to that point. But like I say, I'm assuming most of these people here drive the car. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't look like this. It'll be a while before this will affect the other operation of the car that get to the fuel injection. But it's a good idea if you've never looked in the tank to go through the opening there. And I guess we'll show it on the other vehicle how to gain access. It's very simple. Pull the cover off, take a look up top. Besides problems from the inside, you've got an assault from the outside from when you wash the car, if you drive in the rain. Everything that drains off the windshield drains down to right about here. There's an opening in your cowl. All the water drains down and hits the top of the fuel pump and then runs down here and drains down these holes. That's what these are for water drain. But if your cover boot is shrunken, and most of the cars that have any miles at all, this cover boot will shrink to the point where it pulls up over the clamp, and you get a little water past that, and then you look inside here. This one's actually not that bad. I see cars that come in where they'll have water in there stagnating. These studs will have rotted virtually off the pump. You'll rust the wires right off the pump. Or you'll see all the rust in there and the car's still running. You pull the pump out, and I usually cap it off and I'll glass bead the pump to see how bad it is. You blow a hole in the side of the pump. And you're supposed to have this hose, and this is the $90 special I'm telling you about. Hooks to the pump, like this, okay? It's bolted into the tank. You got to make sure you don't go crazy if you do take this out, tightening down the stud, because you do have some spring tension with the retaining spring. We're missing one here, it's in the tank, but there's supposed to be 2 springs. This one holds the outside, and then there's another one that comes down and holds the screen flat on the bottom. And then you have this little serrated plastic panel. And that's to keep 2 things, all right? So to keep water, if you have small amounts of water in a tank, keep it from immediately getting sucked in, okay, to the baffle, or to the screen, I should say. And the primary purpose is if you're low on fuel and you make a turn, you've got the return hose, which is not here, but that gets clipped, the return hose gets clipped into this unit. It's constantly pumping the return fuel back into this and keeping this full. So the tank might be almost totally out of fuel, but this should be full of fuel. all right? And that'll keep you from, when you're going around the corners or hard acceleration, sucking air. If you suck air on this car, and you almost will hit the windshield if you're not strapped in. The car will just stop like you hit the brakes. So, and have you had this car low on gas? Have you driven around?
Oh, I've got that problem all the time.
Okay. I'm glad you didn't say I've never had a problem.
Oh, no. You see, almost get through the window.
You have to have this in there.
When you're talking
Yeah.
about the hose, Dave done it about a year ago, and I had the parts, but it was the aftermarket hose. And
The problem with the hose is not molded. Right. Well, what happens is there are a lot of the tops, okay, but the bottoms were not available. I had those made up, I don't know, a year ago or something. So now I get the tops from Steve, and then I have the bottom, so that if you're missing it, you can get it. All right. Okay. And so I've actually, and the suppliers usually, I kind of talked to them about the problem and whatnot, but they didn't change it to what I thought was right. So now I had these made up in the same material, but what I've done is I made them a little bit, like about 2 millimeters, not even, just a slight bit wider, and I make sure that there's a little bit of extra length on them. So when you put them down, they go flush to the bottom. So it gives you a lot of times from the factory, they'd be up here right from the get-go. So you've got a lot more room for it to shrink a little bit and still have coverage on it.
them now, they're back to the slick looking material.
The ones that I sell now look like a stock one, all right? And it's because rubbers have different properties, and unfortunately, with one property, you'll have an advantage of say, cracking, that type of thing. You'll have a disadvantage of shrinkage. And it's still the way it is now. We were talking about different kinds of rubbers, and it turned out that what they made it from is over the long term, if you deal with the shrinkage problem, is still the best way to go. So I've gone back, and in fact, I used to also use another person's boot, and I've had to have this made up as well for a couple of other reasons, sort of similar. So it's very expensive to do that as far as tooling and whatnot. But it winds up being the same thing, all right? These nuts will tend to back off. When they back off, the shims will start turning around. On this side, for whatever reason, there's no shims on this one. There always are generally, unless there's been a problem with the car where it's been hit or they're compensating for something worn. Generally, you're going to have between 2 and 5 shims on each one, which there are some on this side in case somebody wants to take a look at that at some point. When these loosen up, the shims tend to move around until they get upside down and then they drop out of the car. If you have the car aligned, do not allow an alignment shop to put their shims in it. You really need to get these because they're sort of a horseshoe and they kind of knock in place, and there's very limited material on this. You're only talking about maybe a 60 or say an 1/8 inch lip around the arm to where the arm fits over these shims to grab for contact. A lot of guys with the alignment shims, they'll put it in and you'll have an 1/8 inch of clearance in there. Because on a normal car, usually it's control arms or something, it's not a problem. But if you have an oversized shim in there, the thing is going to loosen up no matter what you do, and eventually it will fall out. So you got to be aware that you really should go with if you're going to go to an alignment shop, buy 3 or 4 of the factory type shims. They're still available. Bring them with you and just tell them you got to use these. The other thing that you got to stress to them, they have to be torqued. All right. Factory spec is 55 pounds. I usually go 55, 60, and I always double nut. I'll use a lock nut on the outside, but I'll use a regular nut, torque that to spec on the inside, and then I'll torque the lock nut on top to slightly, maybe 50 pounds. If you do that, the bolt will never loosen up and back off. You can still bend the bolt because of the way it's designed. It's a tremendous load. The whole weight of the car is on this bolt when you hit a pothole. It's tugging at it. But it'll only bend by hitting a mega pothole. Rather than, once this loosens, it becomes very unstable and the bolt will bend very easily when that loosens, particularly when the shims fall out. But to torque this, you need a crow's foot adapter. You cannot get a torque wrench on there unless you have a crow's foot, where you have basically a tip of a wrench on a adapter so that you can put it on the torque wrench. Okay? So it's very important to do that. If you have the car aligned, they must be able to torque it. I recommend strongly double nutting it, and I recommend using the factory shims. If you've got a bolt that's bent, and the way to tell that is you put it up in the air, you remove the shields, you loosen it up, and then you just turn it from the other side where the head of the bolt is. You just spin it. And if you see the arm move, even a fraction, then it's bent. And good idea if it's bent at all to replace it. If it's bent, generally you're going to also have a cracked bushing. and you should take it out and replace that at the same time. At the same time, you may find these bolts are rusted. I would also change those. Some cars, the mounting bolts for the bushing will be double nutted on the inside, and they're a pain in the neck to get them on, particularly on an automatic. They're very difficult to get on, but it's worth doing. You know, run the extra length bolt on there and put the lock nut on the back. The factory seemed to get lazy as they went on and stopped doing the lock nuts, particularly on the automatics, because they're so hard to get on. But I would always recommend double nutting the back of it, just like I would here. The factory never double nutted the outside on the trailing arm, so that's something you're definitely going to wind up doing yourself. Yes. If you're working on a car, say you've got a lot of miles on your car, another thing to look for after you get past the front of the trailing arm is normal wear and tear on the bushings on the link arms. All right, lower link arms, because they have offsets and they're not always tensioned. You know, they're not like sideways on the normal, you know, installation of the car. They last a lot longer than the uppers, because the upper ones, you twist the arm to get the bolt in, so the bushings are always distorted when the car is at rest. So the upper arms wear out, the bushings wear out much quicker. If you're driving the car and you're on the highway, you go on an off ramp, the car feels loose, generally you got either a problem here, or you're going to have a problem with these that are worn. And you'll see that they're split, starting to push out. Usually the best way on that is to just change the whole control arm, because now the bushings are up around the $50 range, because they had to be made as well. And an arm with a pair of bushings in it now is about $117. So for the $17 difference, you don't have to fuss with, you know, getting the bushings in and out. They're pressed in really tight. So that's probably the best way to go. Actually, it's almost good to break for lunch because I'm running out of voice. Anybody have any questions?
Is there any kind of protection you could put on the fence itself?
Very few paints are resistant to it. My recommendation is to keep an eye, make sure that the units are in good shape, because if they're in decent shape, they will not leak. So it makes more sense to me to make sure that you don't have a hydraulic leak than to worry about dealing with it, you know, after the fact. There are certain paints that are resistant to it. Offhand, I can't tell you which one to use, but if you talk to, you know, a paint supply, tell them what you're trying to do, there's probably a coating you can put on there to help that. But then the problem with that is that to do it in the areas that you're going to need to do it, you're going to have to pull the fuel tank down. Return back to idle, hit the accelerator, and then it comes back down. It's fairly common, and it's a little tricky to resolve because it can be any one of several problems. If your throttle cable is over-adjusted, it's a little bit too tight, it'll hold the spool open a little bit, and that'll cause a little bit of air to get through. And so it's just a matter of releasing the tension on the cable, either loosening the little bolt right here, 8mm bolt, pulling the cable out slightly, or taking a little bit of the tension off the adjuster right over here. Okay, you can pull that, bring that in a little bit, give yourself a little more free play.
Dirty under there. I had mine stick and it kept going.
Well, you should lubricate it. Okay. This winter or this?
Up under here, I think. I don't know.
These are very rare because bushings, they're plastic and they're self-lubricating. So that's pretty uncommon. But the bell crank, you can get water in here. There's no grease there. That can rust a little bit if you have a problem with it. Or if the bell crank's a little bit too tight, that can be a problem. So sometimes you have to play with the bell crank adjustment. Sometimes the cable. Sometimes somebody's played with the micro switch adjustment. This is for the base idle. And if somebody's cranked that in a half turn too much, you'll have that problem only when it's hot. So if you see that the paint is broken on these pieces there, you may try backing that off a quarter turn at a time until you solve the problem. Okay. At the same time, you should keep the relationship between those two screws the same. All right?
How do you keep these bearings lasting? You know what I mean?
Basically, every time you change the belts on the car, you really should change the bearings because they pretty much go one-to-one.
Well, it's been changed a couple times before 22,000 miles.
Are you using the rubber seal bearing?
No, I haven't changed. I have days to change. When I say they don't last a long time, you
make sure that they have a rubber. So there's some metal shield bearings that will tend to take on water much easier than the rubber shield bearings. Make sure that they, if you look at it, that should be black. That steel color could be your problem. Wrong bearing. Wrong bearing. For that, for that application, because it's from the water that's from that. Otherwise, maybe the belt is overtensioned. It's hard to say. But generally, these things should go, 30,000 miles or so, about the same as the belt is going.
And Russell must do it each month.
Yeah, I'm sure that's part of it.
Things that he's doing with the news page, then we'll try and break it down, so let everybody walk aisle to aisle with myself, Rob, or any of my staff, and we'll identify things, have a good play around with all these cards. Have a good one, and we'll see you back later.
And then it would still be very expensive. Right. And that also, the way I would redo the... When I pulled up on the belt, I forget what, if I had to loosen it, I pulled it up, and I immediately started. That's why I changed my wire harness to an 82. Started frying up. So I was like, I can't sell something like that. Yeah. I just didn't know there was someone playing with it. Look this out, my car burned. So I'd have to totally redo that. And it just doesn't, it's not cost effective.